It is the stories of English, of course. That's what I'm talking about this evening. Not the story of English, which some of you may remember was the title of a television series 20 or more years ago. And the story of English that was told in that particular program, and indeed has been told virtually in the same way for the last 100 years or more, is the story of one kind of English only, the story of standard English. And dialects, the non-standard varieties of English, have been virtually neglected. And quite consciously so. Here's a quote to illustrate the point. H.C. Wilde, A Short History of English, book I cut my teeth on when I went to read English for the first time. Absolutely standard work. And this is what he says when you open his book and look for dialects. You will find them there at the very back in the very last chapter, sort of tucked away at the end somewhere. Fortunately, says Wilde, at the present time, the great majority of the English dialects are of very little importance as representatives of English speech. And for our present purpose, we can afford to let them go, except insofar as they throw light upon the growth of those forms of our language which are the main objects of our solicitude, namely the language of literature and received standard spoken English. Quaint and eccentric, he calls dialects. And those are two of the commonest adjectives for dialects in that particular period of our history. Oh, there's another little quote here. You'll love this one. He allows at one point that there may be sophisticated valleys of dialect use, saying, these certainly differ from the pure old dialect, but is it identical with the English heard in, let us say, in an Oxford or Cambridge common room or in an officer's mess? We should probably say that it was not, says Wilde. Now that captures a whole ethos of attitudes towards dialect in relation to the standard language. Standard English is proper English, is correct English. Dialect is inferior English, is low quality, is deficient in some way, to be judged against the criterion of the standard language. And the names for the dialect situation are, of course, many and various, and they're all negative in their associations, aren't they? People talk about these varieties being patois, or cant, or a lingo of some kind, or broken English, or gutter English, or substandard English. Linguists on the whole have tried to get away from this kind of negative terminology. We talk a lot about non-standard English as the most neutral way of expressing the relationship. But even that is a somewhat negative way of looking at the situation. Something has gone horribly wrong. That's the point. Standard English is the minority dialect. Always has been. Perhaps 1% of the English speakers of the world and use standard English. Or I should say, of course, English writers of the world, because standard English is essentially the dialect of the written language, defined, as you know, by its grammar, by its spelling and its punctuation, and to a minor extent by its vocabulary as well. If people say, what is standard English, we give examples, and there are dozens of them. Like in standard English, we don't use double negatives, for example. Nobody in standard English says, I haven't got nothing, or something like that. I don't have anything. So a double negative is, in current terms, non-standard. Or the use of ain't. I ain't got nothing. Very much non-standard. Or we was sat here. Very much non-standard. And then, of course, in spelling and in punctuation, there are lots and lots of examples of the standardization of the language. We have to spell correctly in order to use standard English well. We have to punctuate correctly insofar as it's possible in order to use standard English well. But that written language, that written definition of standard, is still only a minority of the overall English language use in the world. Nobody's got any real statistics, of course, but how many people speak standard English in that way? I'm doing my best at the moment. And indeed, you will hear standard English spoken on the most public of occasions, and that's why everybody gets the impression that it's universal. But in actual fact, perhaps only 5% at most of the spoken English around the world is going to be standard English. Most people around the world use double negatives and say ain't and have various kinds of irregular verb used in a non-standard sort of way.